about to welcome a man who makes American history come alive, the way Ezekiel saw dry bones get up and march. Tim Barton is the dynamic president of Wallbuilders, that powerhouse ministry dedicated to rebuilding the walls of our national memory by spotlighting America's forgotten heroes and our God-breathed constitutional heritage. Whether he's coaching lawmakers on Capitol Hill, firing up students in classrooms, or co-hosting the Wallbuilders live radio show, Tim wields primary source documents the way David swung his sling accurately and fearlessly and aimed straight at cultural Goliaths. A former youth pastor and ordained minister, Tim marries pastoral warmth with historian's rigor. He's co-authored the hit series, The American Story, First the Beginnings, and hot off the Wallbuilders press, the 2024 sequel, Building the Republic, Planting the Seeds of Liberty in a New Generation. He travels from coast to coast, exposing revisionist myths and reminding us that the same God who parted the Red Sea also parted the Atlantic, bringing pilgrims in pursuit of covenant freedom. When Tim speaks, footnotes meet fiery faith, and audiences leave both informed and ignited. So if you love the Lord and cherish the Constitution and believe America's best days are yet and still ahead, put your hands together and raise a shout like Jericho's walls are tumbling down. Help me welcome my twin brother, my friend, and faithful steward of Wallbuilders, Tim Barton.
Love you, brother.
I love you, brother.
Thank you. I got mics. It was my pleasure to be with you this evening. I want to take us on a journey, but I want to start with some Bible verses, hopefully that we're familiar with. If not, I encourage you add these to your memory verses. And so I'm going to have slides, hopefully on the screen behind me. I'm cueing all of our technical people in a minute. Oh, there they are. So I want to start with a Bible verse. Again, hopefully one that you know. If not, add your memory verse. John 14:6. Jesus saith unto him, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh unto the Father but by me. Let me point out first of all, the last part of that, Jesus makes a claim of exclusivity, meaning that this is the only way. This is important. We live in an era where even people inside the church are being led astray, thinking there's many paths to this final destination. No, Jesus said there's one. That's a claim of exclusivity. He's the only way to the Father. But notice how this started. He said that he was truth. The reason this really matters is there's never been a bigger attack in our culture than the attack we are seeing on truth right now in our culture. And you need to know, when we're talking about truth, whether we're talking about science or genders and boys and girls or whatever it is, there's not just an attack on science, it's an attack on Jesus, because he's where truth came from. He is what truth is. And by the way, the reason there would even be an attack on truth, whether it's science or history or faith or anything else, it's because of what Jesus told the disciples in John 8, verse 32. He said, you will know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. The devil doesn't want us to walk in freedom. And so if he can prevent people from knowing truth, then he can keep them captive to lies. And this is what we have seen happen all over our culture. Now, we spend more time at our organization focusing on American history. So I'm going to spend more time talking about American history and telling stories tonight. But I do want to highlight that this is not just something that we see attacks in history. This is the attack in culture right now. It's the attack of the rising generations are navigating things that we never thought we would have to defend. I mean, genuinely, those of us that have been around a few decades, we never would have thought we had to defend like the reality of boys and girls, or that boys shouldn't be playing in girls' sports or going in their locker rooms or bathrooms. Like, this is so stupid that we're having these conversations, right? But this is This is the assault on truth. Because ultimately, if there is no truth, then the gospel message loses its impact. Because, well, that's fine for you, but here's my truth. No, ultimately, there is no your truth, my truth. There is the truth. We can have opinions, right? But truth exists. And so what I want to do is walk us back and show us some truth of American history where we've misunderstood or gotten things wrong, and maybe give you some entertainment along the way. I'm going to start with a quote from a guy who wrote a dystopian novel back in the 1950s that unfortunately has become one of the most prophetically accurate pictures of our society. If you haven't read the book 1984, I encourage you, go read 1984. George Orwell wrote it, but here's what he said: who controls the past controls the future, who controls the present controls the past. Now that innocuous statement is one of the most accurate descriptions of what's happening. Let me walk you through this. Whoever controls the present controls the past. The people that are in charge of the means of information or education, they're the ones getting to come up with the story about the past, right? So our schools are saying, well, here's actually who the founding fathers were. Here's actually what America was birthed on. Here's actually the people that control the microphone, that control the history books. They're the ones controlling the narrative. Now, why do we even care about that? Well, as he pointed out, whoever controls the past controls the future. Because if America was built on something morally despicable and depraved, then the most moral thing you could do is oppose everything about that. So we should oppose the Constitution or the Declaration or the Bill of Rights. Why? Because if it came from bad people, then we should overthrow those things. This is a Marxist idea. And if you're not familiar ultimately with things like even critical race theory, I'm not going to dive into that tonight, but critical race theory came about in the 1960s. Before that, it was critical theory. It was a Marxist ideology, and critical theory initially applied largely to finances. And the argument was that if there's poor people in the world, the only reason they're poor is because the people who have money took their money away, and therefore the equitable thing to do is say there should be no rich people, take all their money, give it to the poor people. The reason that didn't work in America is because there was too much fluidity and mobility in the economic structure in America. And here's what I would say to illustrate that. Every one of us that have grown up in America, either your parents, your grandparents, or your great-grandparents were in dire poverty. Right? And in one or two or three generations, and by the way, maybe you're the first generation, right? Maybe you're blazing a new trail, you're setting a new standard and trajectory, you're changing the future for your future generation. But the reality is that we have seen too much mobility and fluidity in the market that you can start here and you can finish doing something really significant. And so people didn't buy into this critical theory idea. In the 1960s, they said, well, let's apply it to race. Let's see what happens with race. And this is part of what's led to where we are today with people saying, well, everything about America is evil and we should do away with all this. And I'm not going to spend too much time on race. I just want to point out, like, this is where it's coming from. If you control the narrative about the past, then you are directing the trajectory of the future. And this is what is happening with the current generation, with rising generations, and largely going back to this guy, Howard Zinn, in the 1980s. He wrote a book called A People's History of the United States. And in his book, it was really the first time we saw practically what's known as deconstructionism, where his notion was we should tear down what's been and let's build something new in its place. Now, that's not necessarily bad depending on what you're tearing down and what you're building. However, what he said was, everyone in America that you think was a good person, actually, they were a bad person. So Christopher Columbus, bad. George Washington, bad. Thomas Jefferson, bad. Anybody that somebody might have argued was a good, notable person from American history, he says, nope, they were all bad. Now, it's worth noting that this book was reviewed as one of the most historically inaccurate books historically there's been, but it's still used in universities today telling kids about how bad America is. Now, again, it's part of what deconstructionism is. You want to tear down what's been and build something back in its place. And the problem is, like even today, when people look at our founding fathers, that's who these guys are. These are known as the signers of the Declaration. When people look at the founding fathers, we have heard so many things about them, and we are often taught the narrative in generalities. But the problem is that a lot of us have formed opinions or feelings about the founding fathers when we really don't know very much about the founding fathers. I was just up in Washington, D.C., And I was with a group of legislators, elected officials. We were in the Capitol building at night, did a Capitol tour, and I showed this painting and I told them a story about how every year I go to high schools and colleges and I travel around with these Chick-fil-A gift cards. And I'll show this picture up and I'll tell students, if you can name 5 of these people, I will give you one of these $20 Chick-fil-A gift cards. And I've had the same gift card for 9 years. Okay? Because what happens is people are like, well, Thomas Jefferson. And I'm like, which one is he? And they're like, wait, we have to know who he is? I'm like, well, yeah, you got to know. These are known people, right? And so they'll find, okay, well, there's Thomas Jefferson. There's Benjamin Franklin beside him. I said, cool, who else? George Washington. I'm like, well, he wasn't there. He was commander of the military. To help you out, James Madison wasn't there. Alexander Hamilton wasn't there, right? So who else do we know? And so I'm telling the story to the legislators, and they're like, oh, that's so embarrassing for the kids. And I'm like, hang on, cocky people, right? Can you name 5? And none of them could. Now, hang on, cocky people, before you groan at somebody else not knowing 5. Here's the point I want to make, okay? These founding fathers, all of them are known individuals. And by the way, even just a committee of 5, the guys that did the Declaration, you have John Adams, you have Sherman, you have Livingston, you have Jefferson, and you have Franklin. These are very well-known individuals, and I can go around the room and name most of them, but here's the point. The fact that we don't even know who they are, and yet we formed opinions about them, whether they were all racist or bigoted, or whether they were deist, or whatever the argument might be, it's really silly to have a strong emotive opinion about somebody you know nothing about. Right? Like we should know better than that, and yet this is what happens. And by the way, as we're coming up on Friday, we have the 4th of July, and really as we get toward next year with the 250th anniversary, there's gonna be a lot of people saying a lot of things and a lot of stories. And most of the stories, if you don't know the actual story, then you don't know if you're reading a fake story. And this is part of the challenge and problem is a lot of Americans are believing things that aren't true because we don't know the difference. But let me walk through some of this thought with you together. So just big picture. As we get ready to celebrate the 4th of July, there are a lot of videos you can find online. I actually have done these for some different TV programs, man on the street interviews, where you walk up and you're like, hey, can I ask you a few questions? Okay, so what are we celebrating on the 4th of July, right? You just start asking questions. And I don't know if you remember when I was growing up, like Jay Leno was still the Tonight Show host and he did jaywalking, like Jesse Waters, you had Will Witt from PragerU, like all these people have done this. And you see it and you're like, oh, it's so embarrassing, nobody knows anything. Right, but the reality is we know very little even about the holiday we're about to celebrate. So let me give you a crash course. As we get ready to celebrate the 4th of July, we're celebrating the declaring of independence from King George III in the Declaration of Independence. Also worth noting, the Declaration of Independence has been removed from most public school curriculum. So most kids are not growing up even learning this basic thought. Like, where do we come up with the idea that there was a God who gave us rights and government's job is to protect those rights? That's a declaration. Today, most people don't know it. And I don't think it's far-fetched to say that at one point you might have to help teach your kids or your grandkids some thoughts on the Declaration. So how do you break this down for them? Here to me is the easiest and best explanation of the Declaration. The Declaration of Independence was the greatest breakup letter ever written, where we were like, hey, it's not working out, and to be clear, it's not me, it's you, here's all your problems, right? Like that's what the Declaration was. It was a listing of grievances, why we're separating from the king, and it's also worth pointing out that the primary author of the Declaration was Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was 33 years old when he drafted the Declaration, and I remember being a teenager and being like, 30-year-olds are so old. I mean, right, remember growing up as a kid, and your parents are in their 30s, and they're like, they are so old. And then as we grow up, we're like, 30 is not old. Like, let's be clear, okay? It is not old. But what's also worth noting is when you get to 33, you don't gain inherent brilliance and wisdom, right? So for Jefferson, as a 33-year-old, to be able to articulate the political philosophy of the nation in this incredibly profound manner, it's quite significant. And if we look at the Declaration, we would know some of these phrases, like in the second paragraph where it said, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just power from the consent of the governed. These are just a matter of like 55 words from the second paragraph. But what's interesting is what Jefferson lays out as a primary author of the Declaration, his starting place, he said, we hold these truths to be self-evident. Now, Notice what they rallied around. We live in a culture that is not sure truth even exists anymore. This is genuinely a big deal. If truth doesn't exist, what do we rally around? This is why there's some major problems even in the political spectrum, because where do we find common ground? Well, the founding fathers argued about a lot. They said, no, there's some things we all agree are true. And it's also worth noting, they said those truths were self-evident, meaning these truths are so obvious, like any dummy should know this, right? Like this is really obvious. Well, what did they say was so obvious anybody should know it? They said, well, that we're created equal, that we have rights from God, our creator, and that government exists to protect those rights. Like this is super obvious. All of us know this. Let me ask you a non-rhetorical question. If we look at these rights, are those rights obvious and self-evident? Are they obvious in the world? Okay, now I want you to think about that. Because these are not actually self-evident truths. They're self-evident to us, but not to the world, and I'm going to tell you why in a second. But let's just point out, this notion that we're created equal in the world today, if you go to the Middle East and these Muslim nations, they don't believe in equality, not between men and women, and certainly not between Islam and some other religion, right? The idea that we have God-given rights, you think Putin, right? Do you think over in China they believe in God-given rights? Of course not. The idea that government exists for the primary purpose of protecting your rights, we don't even have a majority of Congress in America today that probably believes that, right? These are not self-evident truths, by the way. They weren't self-evident to the king, which is why we separated. Oh, let me back up. But what's worth noting about this, when one of their self-evident truths that we're created equal, one of the arguments today is that, well, the founding fathers didn't believe like an equality. They believed that the king shouldn't be able to tell them what to do. So they believed in equality between white people, but not with like white and black people because they had slaves. So if they had slaves, they couldn't have believed in equality. This is one of the arguments today against this self-evident truth. Now, the thing I would tell you is significant is when somebody is making a claim, the burden of proof is on them to defend their position, but until we're asking them to defend their position, I want you to see some evidence so you can ask some more informed questions. So just as an example, if you go back to the original draft of the Declaration, when we saw that famous painting and there were those 5 guys and they're putting down these documents, that's the original draft they're putting down. This is what it is. You can go online today, you can go to the National Archive, you can just look it up, basic Google search. Original draft of the Declaration is 4 pages. This first page is where they lay out their political philosophy. That second paragraph, we hold these truths to be self-evident. Second page, they start listing grievances. Third page, listing grievances. Fourth page is where he wraps up his political philosophy. There's 24 grievances in the original draft. Now, the final draft, there's 27 because they debate. A few things changed, some wording changes, but in the original draft, there's 24, and the last grievance is here on the 3rd page. And the last grievance is nearly half of the 3rd page. The last grievance, which Jefferson actually talks about, he spent more time, put more effort and energy into this grievance than anything else. And if you can read cursive, you actually can get this blown up, you can read it, where it says he has waged cruel war. Now, I'm gonna put it up in text because it's easier to read than his cursive handwriting that's a little digitized. But I do wanna encourage you, look this up. Don't take my word for this. This is the longest grievance of the Declaration. The reason he's saying we should separate from the king, he said, this is the number one reason we should separate. Here's what he said. He said, he has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating his most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. Now let me pause you. That's very clearly talking about the slave trade, right? Like just make sure we're together. He's talking about people being captive, carried from one continent to another where millions died on that voyage, right? That's what we're talking about, the slave trade. He says, this piratical warfare, the opprobrium of infidel powers. Let's pause. The word infidel is actually underlined in the original draft. But he says, this piratical warfare. What does piratical warfare mean? It's the warfare of pirates. And he says that these are unbelieving, infidel pirates. Well, who are the unbelieving pirates associated with the North Atlantic African slave trade? It's the Barbary pirates of North Africa, the Muslim pirates, who are the ones who actually started the North Atlantic slave trade. Jefferson said, right? The king of Great Britain is doing what the Muslim pirates are doing. And he goes on, he said, this is the warfare of the Christian king of Great Britain, determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold. In the original draft, the word men, and I'm going to back up because I want you to see this in the original draft. The word men is, there's Christian underlined, the word men is printed and fully capitalized. He said the king is doing what these Muslim pirates are doing. The king says he's a Christian, but he's doing this, and notice, where men should be bought and sold. Now, part of why that matters is because Jefferson already wrote in the second paragraph, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And he just clarified, by the way, that includes everybody who's being enslaved, taken from Africa to anywhere else around the world. His grievance didn't stop there. He continued, he said, he has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt. Now, what does it mean to suppress a legislative attempt? Well, this is where the colonies would write a law, and the king would veto that law. He said, you're British colonies, you have to do what I say. You can't do your own thing. This is no different than if a president vetoed something Congress did, or if a governor vetoed something their state legislature did. But let me point out, there were 4 colonies in 1773 that passed laws against the slave trade and against slavery. The king vetoed all of them in 1774, which led guys like Benjamin Franklin to say, this is one more reason we should separate from the king, because he won't even let us in slavery in our own colonies. Now, to go further, in 1773, after those laws have been passed, Benjamin Franklin wrote Reverend Dean Woodward a letter, and in that letter, he explained some of what was happening in Pennsylvania and even some of the colonies. Here's what he said. A disposition to abolish slavery prevails in North America that many of Pennsylvanians have set their slaves at liberty, and that even the Virginia Assembly, and I love this because Pennsylvania was definitely one of the more stronger anti-slavery states, but when he says that in Pennsylvania we're going against slavery, and even Virginia, like this is Franklin being surprised. He's like, even Virginia, like I didn't know they were going to do this, but even Virginia have petitioned the king for permission to make a law for preventing the importation of more into that colony. So in Pennsylvania, they're already setting their slaves free. Virginia is petitioning the king, and here's what he said next sentence. This request, however, will probably not be granted, as their former laws of that kind have always been repealed. Now, if there's former laws, what does that mean? This isn't the first time they tried this. Have always been repealed. The king has always said no, which is actually why Jefferson, in the largest and longest grievance in the original draft of the Declaration, said, well, this is one of the biggest reasons we want to leave is because we can't even end slavery in our own colonies. Now, what's also worth noting is when it comes to the Continental Congress, this is the Committee of Five. When Jefferson writes that in these original documents, it comes back to the Congress, and John Hancock, who's sitting in that chair, he was the president of Congress, he said they would only include in the final draft what was unanimously agreed to. He said, because otherwise, if we have disagreements, the king might be able to come in and pull us apart by our own separate disagreements, and we're gonna have to make sure whatever we do, we all unanimously agree to. So they start going line by line through the Declaration to make sure everybody agrees to it. They get to this last grievance. And this is the records of Congress. Jefferson actually writes about this in his own journal. He regrets, he says, that there were not more ardent, outspoken abolitionists who would oppose the 2 colonies who said we don't need to include that grievance. The 2 colonies were Georgia and South Carolina. And they said, well, we've never tried to end the slave trade or slavery. The king hadn't vetoed any of our laws, so we don't have that grievance with the king. So it was removed. However, it's worth noting that today, people look and go, well, all the founding fathers, these racist, bigoted slaveholders. Hang on. When we separate from Great Britain, this wasn't a unanimous part of the Declaration, but every single northern colony, once they became independent, every single northern colony began passing laws for the abolition of slavery. By 1804, every single northern colony had passed laws to abolish slavery, New Jersey being the last one in 1804. And this is actually according to the will and wishes of the majority of the founding fathers. Today, most people think, well, the founding fathers were these racist, bigoted slaveholders. That's the narrative today. It's just not historically correct. And let me give you some context in that. There were 56 guys that signed the Declaration. It is argued that 41 of the signers at some point in their lifetime owned slaves. And the question that I always ask, that I've never had anybody who's in the founding fathers or racist can't be able to tell me, of the 41 that at some point in their life owned slaves, how many of them actually freed their slaves, came out against slavery, maybe worked for, funded, promoted abolition societies to make sure slavery stopped in the nation. Like, how many went from owning slaves to like totally anti-slavery? And nobody knows that. Why? Because we've never told the rest of the story in the modern narrative. Let me give you an easy example. So Benjamin Franklin, right, the guy who wrote that letter about in Pennsylvania, they're already setting their slaves free. Benjamin Franklin is one of the slave-owning founding fathers. Except there's not a single historian that considers Franklin a racist. Why? Because before it ever comes to the Declaration of Independence, Franklin actually freed his slaves. Franklin actually then encouraged and promoted the beginning of the very first abolition society in America, 1774 in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia. And then 11 years later, when Franklin is at the Constitutional Convention, at this point he's the oldest guy there, but while he's there, he actually is the president of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. So he went from owning slaves to freeing his slaves to help found the first abolition society to become the president of that society, right? There's no way you can be like, well, this dude was totally racist. Now, you can say at some point in his life he owned slaves. That's true, right? But this is like the equivalent of being like, well, guys, you know the Apostle Paul hated Christians his whole life. No, there was a point in his life, right, when he was on the wrong side. And then God did something in his life, and it was a total radical transformation. He was never the same, right? The dishonest thing that we are doing is we are pretending like that nobody ever did anything good and all they ever did was bad. And therefore, when we see things in the Declaration, like one of the self-evident truths that we're all created equal, well, they only talked about white people. It is one of the very dishonest takes of American history. But if you don't know the truth, you don't even know you're being lied to. And most of us have believed the modern narrative because this is what everybody says, right? Well, of course they all had slaves. No, again, first of all, they didn't all have slaves. There were 56 signers, 41 of them at some point in their life owned slaves. I was talking at a university one time. At the end, there was an open mic Q&A, and there was a professor who got up and said, Tim, how can you say the founding fathers were these moral, honorable people when we know that all of them owned slaves? And I said, well, just to be clear, are you saying all of them owned slaves? And he said, well, of course, we know all of them owned slaves. And I was like, okay. By the way, I don't mind playing games. I like games. Games are fun. And sometimes the dumber the game is, the more I like it, right? So like, I'll play your dumb game. That's no problem. I said, okay, well, what about John Adams? He said, what about John Adams? I said, I'm pretty sure John Adams never owned slaves and fought against slavery his whole life. He said, well, I don't know about John Adams, but all the others did, right? And I'm like, already you said all of them did. So all I had to do is show one wasn't to prove you wrong, but I'll keep playing your game because I'm pretty sure I know this better than you do, right? I said, okay, what about Sam Adams? He said, what about Sam Adams? I'm pretty sure Sam Adams never had slaves and fought against slavery his whole life. And I went through 5 or 6 founding fathers before finally he says, okay, I don't actually know who had slaves and who didn't, but I know the majority did. You just said you don't even know. Right? But this is the problem, is people don't even know what's true. They're just used to promoting a narrative. And this is the world we are living in. Now, let me go back to this, because a couple of things about this notion that these truths are self-evident, these are not self-evident truths. It wasn't self-evident to the king, which is why we were separating. The reason we were becoming our own nation is because the king didn't believe these things. These truths are only self-evident to one kind of people. They're only self-evident to people that know the Bible. Because where do we come up with the idea that we were created equal? Well, you learned that in Genesis, that male and female, he created them in his image, he created them. Also worth pointing out, you can study the Bible all you want, and you will never find the answer to one question. What color were Adam and Eve? The Bible doesn't tell us what shape, size, or color Adam and Eve were. Why? Because that doesn't matter. That's not where value comes from. We live in a world that says, here's the most important thing. When the most important thing to you is something God didn't think was important enough to even mention, I'm going to say you messed it up, right? Like, we have confused this issue, but let's go further. Not only do we get this notion created equal, where do we get the idea that we have God-given rights? Well, this is the Garden of Eden. Before there was ever a government created, Adam and Eve had rights. God gave them the freedom of speech, the freedom of choice, the freedom of religious choice. God was giving rights all the way back in the beginning. This is why we knew our rights don't come from government, they come from God, because we could clearly track and see that. Now, where do we get the idea that government exists to protect our God-given rights? That was Genesis 9, because after Noah on the ark lands on Mount Ararat, Noah gets off the ark, the very first civil ordinance God ever gave to man, he gave to Noah, and it was the command that if man sheds blood, by man his blood will be shed. Meaning if there's a murderer, we're going to, collective society, get together, we're going to get rid of that dude. Why? We're going to make sure that in this new standard that we protect inalienable rights like the right to life. So if there's a murderer, if they're taking away a right to life, they forfeit. And not to be contradictory in this, God is very pro-life. But if someone does something as heinous as murder, God said, we're going to require the highest penalty from them for what they've done, which was their life. And that's how much God valued life, that he ascribed the highest penalty to it in the midst of this. Now, again, this is just backing up. Where did they learn these ideas? Well, this is clearly what the Bible taught. But to say the founding fathers were influenced by the Bible, a lot of people would be confused by that notion. But if you go back previous generations, Clinton Rossiter was a professor at Cornell University. He wrote a book back in the early 1900s called The Seed Time of the Republic. And in this book, he said, most of the ideas that birthed America, they came from 6 people. And the 6 people he identified that came up with the ideas that birthed America, he said you had Benjamin Franklin, Richard Bland, you had the Reverend Thomas Hooker, the Reverend Roger Williams, the Reverend John Wise, and the Reverend Jonathan Mayhew. Those are the people that came up with the ideas that birthed America. Now, previous generations identifying the most significant, involved, influential, mind-thinking people, notice in this list of 6, 4 of them are pastors. Now, most of us, you might have heard of Jonathan Mayhew, maybe, but like really, I doubt we really know many of these guys at all. Let me give you an easy example that used to be well known. It's very well documented, but John Wise is a great example. John Wise was a pastor in Ipswich, Massachusetts, in the late 1600s, early 1700s. He actually did several volumes of sermons. There's one volume that, his last volume actually came out in 1717. But in this volume of sermons, he actually preached sermons where he said things like, taxation without representation is tyranny. He preached that God's preferred form of government was the consent of the governed. He preached that all men are created equal and have certain inalienable rights from their creator. Now, all of those are phrases that appear verbatim in the Declaration of Independence, but this was from a book of sermons in 1717. So how did sermons from 1717 influence the founding fathers? Because those sermons were reprinted in 1772. And who reprinted them? Well, actually, the Sons of Liberty reprinted them. Because as they were working, trying to bring people together, they said, we need to make sure that we are thinking alike on some of these issues. And one of them, they were from Massachusetts, one of the guys said, hey, I've got this book of sermons. John Wise did a brilliant job of explaining so many of these basic thoughts. And they reprinted those sermons and they distributed them through all the 13 colonies. When the founding fathers came together in 1776, it wasn't a coincidence that they are repeating lines from John Wise, because all of them had received and read the sermons of John Wise. Now, who were the guys that did this? You have guys, oh, by the way, historian B.F. Morse talked about the influence of John Wise and some of what he did as well. He said some of the most glittering sentences in the immortal Declaration of Independence are almost literal quotations from this essay of John Wise. It was used as a political textbook in the great struggle for freedom. And all I want to do is point out, this is a noted historian at the time of the Civil War who's talking about one of the most significant influences for the Declaration was this pastor. This is how well known it was. In fact, even Calvin Coolidge, on the 150th anniversary of the Declaration, he went back to Independence Hall, which is where they wrote the Declaration, and he gave a very noted speech. You can actually find his speech online. It's a good speech. It's worth going and reading if you have time. But part of what he said in his speech, the thoughts in the Declaration can very largely be traced back to what John Wise was writing. Here was the doctrine of equality, of popular sovereignty, and inalienable rights asserted by Wise. Even pastors used to know. That John Wise guy, he's where these ideas largely came from. And I want to point that out because, again, if we look back at the founding fathers, we don't often think of them being influenced by pastors. Sam Adams, easy example. If you ask a college student today, what do you know about Sam Adams? There's usually one thing college students know about Sam Adams, right? Well, he's the beer guy, right? It's sad for his legacy, because he was known as the father of the American Revolution. He's one of the guys actually that reprinted those sermons of John Wise, so that's his leadership. Also, he's one of the leaders of the Sons of Liberty. So when you look at everything from the Boston Massacre to the Boston Tea Party, Sam Adams is one of the very vocal leaders in the midst of this. In 1772, they decide they need to do a committee of correspondence, so they're going to write a letter and they're going to send it out to the colonies. Sam Adams writes the very first ever committee of correspondence. It had 3 parts. It was the rights of the colonists as British subjects, the rights of the colonists as Christians, and the rights of the colonists as men. Well, the second section was the rights of the colonists as Christians, and I'm going to read you his opening line in this segment of his letter. He said, the rights of the colonists as Christians may be best understood by reading and carefully studying the institutes of the great lawgiver and the head of the Christian church, which will be found clearly written and promulgated in the New Testament. Sam Adams says, if you want to understand like where we're coming from, you should read the New Testament and study the life of Jesus. Okay, that's Sam Adams and the very first ever committee of correspondence, the thing that helps bring the founding fathers together that leads to American independence. And he's saying, read your Bible and study Jesus? Yes. And looking at the founding fathers today, people go, wait a second, but like we heard they're not really religious or separation of church or state, or like they're atheists, agnostics, and deists. And it's so much nonsense. The most quoted book in the founders' writings, and it's not even close, the most quoted source in the founders' writings was the Bible, and it's not even close. Over 34% of all of their things in quotation marks are Bible verses, but the professors who did that research study said they only included in their study what was in quotation marks. Had they included the obvious references to scripture in the founders' writings that were not in quotation marks, it would have been more than 40% of every quote in their writings came from the Bible. Now, if we were to go back and write letters, we don't really do that anymore, but if you're gonna write letters, and you're gonna use famous lines or quotes, I'd be using lots of like Hollywood movies, right? I'd be quoting everything from like Dumb and Dumber, Three Amigos, Tombstone, right? Like over 40% of all of their quotes came from the Bible, okay? Like that is significant. And today, we largely think they weren't religious because we don't even know their stories anymore. We really don't even know their names. But let me just give you an easy example. So John Adams, very noted name. He's the first vice president. He signs the Declaration, very involved. He's the second president. Well, he actually openly talked about some of his faith and his views on the Bible. Here's one of the things he wrote. I've examined all religions, and the result is that the Bible is the best book in the world. There's two really important thoughts there. First of all, most Christians don't really know what to believe or why they should believe what they should believe. He didn't just say the Bible is the best book. He said, I've examined it all. We'd call that apologetics, right? Like I know what's out there, and I know where their flaws are. I know what's wrong, and I know why the Bible is the best book. Well, he went on and explained even more. He said, suppose a nation in some distant region should take the Bible for their only law book, and every member should regulate his conduct by the precepts there exhibited. So imagine if there was a place and all they did was just read the Bible and do what it says. What would that place look like? Here's what he concluded. What a utopia, what a paradise would this region be? If people would just read and do what the Bible says, right. His son, John Quincy Adams, who went on to become the sixth president, John Quincy Adams wrote about the way they viewed the Bible when he was growing up. Here's what he said. With regard to the history contained in the Bible, it is not so much praiseworthy to be acquainted with it as it is shameful to be ignorant of it. Now, that's interesting. He said it's not impressive to know the Bible. It's embarrassing not to know the Bible. I would counter in our culture today, right? You don't need to be embarrassed for not knowing the Bible. That makes you normal. But the reason we respect the Bible teachers we like the most, we respect them the most because of how well they know the Bible, right? What he said is that used to make people normal, not special, right? And practically think about this. If in a room full of educated adults, I said, hey, what's 2 + 2? It's not impressive if anybody gets that right, but it'd be real embarrassing if somebody got that wrong, right? It's not impressive for us to know what should be obvious. It would be embarrassing for us to not know what should be obvious. And that's what he said about the Bible. Now, where does he learn these ideas? Obviously, he's talking about the culture he grew up in, but certainly he's influenced by his mom and dad growing up. Abigail Adams, John Adams, they're an amazing couple, their relationship, a lot of cool things about them. But during the Revolution, John Adams is gone almost the entire Revolution, which means Abigail is at home raising the family, taking care of business all by herself. She's kind of single mom life for most of the Revolution. And where they're from, the church where they attended is still in existence today. And outside the church, there actually was a little monument erected that is Abigail Adams and John Quincy Adams, showing them on their way to church, because what was so well known was they were committed to faith and they were going to be in church every Sunday no matter what else was going on. Well, that's kind of a cool depiction of their faith journey. Well, let me give you even more. So John Quincy Adams, as he grows up, and this is a painting of him from 12 years old. I like to include this so that everybody in the room knows everybody has bad yearbook photos, right? Don't feel bad. Everybody had them. When he grows up, when the revolution unfolds, you have the shot heard around the world, Lexington Green, then you have Concord. 6 weeks later, you have Battle of Bunker Hill. He was 7 years old, and he actually watched the Battle of Bunker Hill with his mom. So he grows up seeing this happen. And if you're a kid watching this, that impacts you, right? When he actually continues on, when he was 8 years old, let me back up. When he was 8 years old, his dad took a musket down and gave it to him. And the Massachusetts Minutemen used to do their musket drills in front of John Adams' home. And John Adams gives John Quincy Adams a musket. He's 8 years old and says, son, you need to go out and start training because there's no telling when you might need to know how to use this to defend yourself or the family. Now, when you're an 8-year-old getting that, again, that's gonna grow you up fast, right? You're seeing war happen all around you. You're getting a gun, you're training with the military. Like this is a different kind of life. When he was 10 years old, he got to go with his dad on a diplomatic mission over to Paris. And what's really fun is there's a letter from his mom to John Quincy Adams. And based on the letter, it's easy to deduce that John Quincy Adams apparently was supposed to write his mom a letter. Like once he got over there, hey mom, I'm here. Dad's feeding me, we're fine, right? Like whatever it is, either he did not write the letter got lost, or it hadn't arrived yet. Because Abigail's letter, she says, I haven't heard from you in months. I don't even know if you're still alive. If you are, you're in trouble because you know you're supposed to have written me. Like this is absolute mom, right? I'm in my 40s and my mom will still be like, text me when you get home. I'm like, mom, I'm a full grown man. I'm fine, right? But like this is mom life, okay? So she writes this letter to him. Well, he's 10 years old, turns 11. He's over in France, and she's reminding him of his upbringing and what he needs to remember while he's over there. And here's part of what she says. Adhere to those religious sentiments and principles which were early instilled into your mind. And remember, you are accountable to your maker for all your words and actions. Now, that's a great thought, but it does remind me, some of us are going to remember, when I was growing up, we used to play outside until it got dark, then you would come home. Right? But I remember my grandmother, when I'd stay with her sometimes, she'd go have fun with your friends, but she'd get her finger up my face. But God watches everything you do, right? Like that was the way it was. Well, this is what Abigail's saying, right? God sees everything you do. Her next line is my favorite. Dear as you are to me, I had much rather you should find your grave in the ocean or an untimely death crop you in your infant years, rather than see you an immoral, wicked, or graceless child. I hope you drown in the ocean, love, mom. Okay, but think about what she is doing in this moment, right? What is she communicating? Because the Bible tells us in Proverbs 22:6, you train up a child in the way they should go, and when he's old, he won't depart from it. What is she doing? She's instilling an eternal perspective. It is way better that you die young, connected to Christ, than you live a long life rejecting faith, right? Like, know which one is better. It is better to be connected to Christ, even if you drown in the ocean, than you grow up and live this heathen, godless life, okay? That's an important principle that they're instilling. Well, this is, again, it's just kind of the way he grows up. As he gets a little bit older, he does, when he's 11 years old, get an official appointment from Congress to be the secretary to America's official diplomat to Paris. Now, that was his father. And so some people might look and go, well, that's kind of nepotism that he got the job for his dad. Well, maybe, except back then, most kids were in school between 10 and 13 years old. And so when you're 11, like he might have already been done with school, you can be very well educated, and it really wasn't nepotism, but because we don't know early education, we don't always see that. But part of why we know it wasn't is because just a couple years later, when he was 14 years old, he got a second congressional appointment before the throne of Catherine the Great in Russia. And this time he wasn't the secretary for the diplomat, he's part of the diplomatic staff. His job as a 14-year-old, he was the official interpreter for the delegation because he was already fluent in 6 languages. I'm still working on one, right? As a Texan, English is even harder. So it's just, we're navigating this, but this is the way he grows up. Well, when George Washington becomes president, George Washington chose him to be a diplomat for America. At the end of Washington's presidency, he said that John Quincy Adams was the best diplomat America had. Then when John Adams becomes president, he's a diplomat under his father. When John Adams loses the presidential election against Thomas Jefferson, John Adams calls him home. He's like, you're not working for that man. And so he came home, but he became a U.S. senator under Thomas Jefferson. Then James Madison becomes president, and James Madison brings him out of diplomatic retirement, and John Quincy Adams is the one who negotiates the end of the War of 1812. Then, when James Monroe becomes president, John Quincy Adams is Secretary of State. He then became the 6th president of the United States of America. Now, this is the most impressive political resume of any president we've ever had. He knew everybody, did everything, worked on literally every part of the early American system and government. But what's interesting is he actually lost his re-election bid to Andrew Jackson. And after he lost his re-election bid, he wasn't sure what he was going to do with his life. And then he determined that he wanted to go back to Congress. Now, he's the only president to have ever been president and then go back to Congress. Why would he do that? He said there's a great evil that is yet to be remedied. He went to Congress and became the leader of the anti-slavery movement in Congress. In fact, they gave him the nickname in Congress, the Hellhound of Abolition, because this was the issue he really cared about, fought against his entire life. Well, he was in Congress for 17 years. And when he first got there, Congress was primarily pro-slavery. And so he had a really hard time getting any traction. But one of the things you actually can do even to this day is the First Amendment says that you can petition Congress for a redress of your grievances. You can write Congress a letter like, hey, we need you to pass a law on this. Well, because he's the leader of the anti-slavery movement, he's the political face, when there were anti-slavery petitions coming in, he would get a stack of them. And once a week, Congress would open up for petitions and they'd assign committees. And so he walked in with stacks of petitions. One of those days, he walked in with over 900 petitions. And Congress, who is at this point, the majority of them are like fine with slavery. They're like, we don't want to hear 900 petitions. So they went to Rules Committee and they passed a brand new rule. They called the rule the John Quincy Adams gag order. Literally what they called it. It was made to shut this dude up. The rule said, you cannot bring up any issue we've previously voted on, specifically the issue of slavery. And it was made to try to stop this discussion from happening because they don't want to keep talking about this anti-slavery position. He didn't stop. He kept going, and so he was censored. He was reprimanded. At times, they tried to expose him from Congress, and he does this for years. One day, a reporter comes to him and says, Mr. Adams, you've been fighting for years against slavery, and there's not really been signs of success for you. Why or how do you stay motivated when you haven't been successful? His answer was brilliant. His answer was based on his life motto. He wrote, his life motto is duty is ours, results are God's. What he told the reporter, he said, it's only up to me to do the right thing. It's up to God what happens after that. Well, this is the way he lived his life. Well, while he's there, he continues on. And in Congress, you serve for a 2-year term. His last term in Congress, there was a young freshman who was elected. And the freshman who gets elected, he joins the anti-slavery movement. John Quincy Adams is a political face. And at this point, you're in like to the 1840s. So the anti-slavery movement is very strong, but the nation is becoming very fractured. And this young freshman hears John Quincy Adams every week give these impassioned speeches about the evils of slavery. Well, John Quincy Adams got up one day to make a speech. He clutched his chest. He fell over his desk. He had a stroke and died in the Capitol building. And when he died, this young freshman determined, okay, I'm gonna carry on the mantle. And by the way, the movement's going strong, but there were a lot of leaders now who were like, I want to take up this political slack because this John Quincy Adams was the face of the anti-slavery political movement. Well, this young freshman wanting to carry on runs for re-election, but he lost his re-election bid. 2 years later, he ran again and lost again. He then ran for Senate and lost in Senate. He ran for state office and lost in state office, and that freshman did not win another election until he became the president of the United States, right? Abraham Lincoln was the guy there. And what's worth noting, Abraham Lincoln is the guy credited with ending slavery, right? Because you had the Emancipation Proclamation, the 13th Amendment, all this stuff going on. But I want to point out that there would not have been an Abraham Lincoln had there not been a John Quincy Adams, right? And this is important because one of the things also we see even biblically is that God often moves in a transgenerational way. Right? He's the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, right? Even Joseph. But as we look, I think a lot of times we look at our nation and we see, man, you know, we might not be able to win these battles. Well, John Quincy Adams fought his entire life for something he never saw realized. And I don't know that he realized that God was using him to train the rising generation who were going to get the job done, that God had to lay that burden on his heart. By the way, we could talk about some of what's happening with the pro-life movement, with Roe versus Wade, and for 50 years people were fighting it. They didn't know what's going to happen. Some of them fought their entire life and did not see the overturning of Roe, but they helped lay the foundation for some of that to happen, right? This is part of the point. And by the way, it's one of the reasons, looking back, John Quincy Adams is one of my favorite founding fathers. And yet today we live in an era, instead of going, man, there's some amazing people, amazing stories, we live in an era that says, wait a second, we can't celebrate those guys because America's bad. The founding fathers were evil. I want to close by giving you a Bible thought on this. So anytime we look for answers, we always should navigate and say, what does the Bible say about this? Well, if you look at the Bible has a lot of leaders it highlights. Okay, one of the most famous leaders from the Bible is King David, right? Easy leader from the Bible. And by the way, King David has some amazing things in the Bible. King David was an amazing warrior. We know that he killed lions. We know that he killed bears. And we know he did it at an early age because before he ever goes to kill Goliath, when Saul says, I think you're too young, he said, oh, it's no problem. I used to watch my dad's sheep. And if a lion or a bear came and they took a lamb, I would chase them down and I would kill them. Scholars think David was 14 to 17 years old when he kills Goliath, which means he's 10, 11, 12 when he's killing lions and bears, right? And I know for some of us, especially for guys, we're like, I think I could do that. Let me give context. Okay, I've been an outdoorsman and a hunter my whole life. Like if one day somebody's like, Tim, let's go to Alaska, grizzly bear hunt, just so you know, I'm in, just so you know, like I'm in, but I'm taking lots of guns. Right? And like big ones, okay? David is a kid killing lions and bears with a stick and a rock, right? Like this is next level. David was an amazing warrior, we know. He's really good at killing things. He's also a man after God's own heart. He writes the majority of Psalms. Like there's some amazing moments of David, but the Bible doesn't stop there with the story of David. The Bible actually tells about David as a father, and it tells about Amnon, the one who had a crush on his sister, the one who raped his sister, and David did nothing. And so then you have Absalom, who's like, well, if my dad's not gonna do anything, I'll solve this problem. Absalom actually kills his brother, and David does nothing. Absalom starts thinking, my dad's not a very good leader. Absalom sets himself up at the city gates, the judge, to take authority from his dad. Absalom leads a violent revolution against his dad, and David runs. Right, it wasn't until David finally let his men go to war, Absalom gets his hair cut in his tree, David's men use him as javelin practice, and he's done. It then says Adonijah wanted the throne from his father as well. And in 1 Kings chapter 1, verse 6, it says Adonijah, comma, the son whom David never corrected. Your entire job as a parent, right, is to train, discipline, guide, correct. David is unquestionably one of the worst fathers in the Bible, genuinely, right? Genuinely. And that might not even be the worst part of David's story, because you also have the moment at a time when kings go to war, right? And there's Bathsheba, and he has the affair, and not just has the affair with Bathsheba, he then has her husband murdered. David is an adulterer and a murderer. But let me point out something. What's interesting about the Bible is it unapologetically, it tells us the whole story. It tells us the good, the bad, the ugly. Now, why this matters? Because if the only part of a story you know is really, really good, you probably don't know the whole story. But if the only part of the story you know is how bad and evil and wicked, you might not know the whole story, right? Because the reality of people is there's good, bad, and ugly, right? And there is no good without Christ, right? But this is the reality, by the way. Also worth noting, what we would say today in modern culture is, well, yeah, but we can't celebrate people that have done bad things. This is what we would say today. I will point out, we just had amazing moments in worship where we were singing the words written by an unloving, absent father who was a murderer and adulterer. How can you sing the songs of that dude? And the answer, as Christians, should be a lot more plain. It's because as Christians, we don't see things the way the world sees them. Our starting place as Christians, is what Paul wrote, that all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. What does that mean? It means everybody is jacked up and they need Jesus, right? But that's our starting point. So if you're gonna be like, wait a second, that person's not perfect. Well, yeah, that's like, I'm starting with that knowledge. I was a youth pastor for 9.5 years. And anytime someone came to me and they were like, I can't believe so-and-so, I was always like, I can. Right? Like, why would we ever be surprised that a human has fleshly moments? The reason Jesus came is because none of us are ever good enough. But why does that matter? Because if we look at any person in history, a noted person who gave incredible contributions to our nation, do you know what you can guaranteed know about that person? They were a sinner in need of a savior. But the reason they were honored or celebrated is not ever because someone thought they weren't a sinner. The reason we used to have enough wisdom and maturity to honor and celebrate them is not because we thought they were perfect. It's because we recognized how a perfect God used those imperfect people and did amazing things through them. Let me give you one more Bible thought as I wrap this all up. In Hebrews 11, it's our faith hall of fame. We're told to look to the heroes of the faith who have gone before us and let their lives be examples to us. I don't know the last time you read Hebrews 11, our examples of the faith. It goes chronological order, but in that order, you have Noah, Abraham, Moses, Rahab, Samson, David. Okay, real quick reminder of the story. Noah, amazing faith, builds the ark, it's never even rained. God's like, it's cool. Go to a really dry place, build a really big boat, like it's fine. It's amazing faith. Yes. After the ark lands on Mount Ararat, he gets off. The Bible tells us he became a farmer and planted a vineyard. And then it tells us not just he got drunk, it says he got drunk and passed out naked. That's a nudist alcoholic, okay? Now, this is not my church, but I'm just thinking, like Pastor Troy, we'd probably talk. Be like, if somebody does that, like you're probably not qualified for leadership of the church, right? Like, just to be clear. Abraham, amazing faith. God tells him just like, go a direction. It's amazing, right? He's also one of the biggest cowards and liars in the Bible because every time he got before some leader, some king, he took his wife, who apparently was beautiful, and he was like, hey, you like this lady? Like, you can have her. He offered his wife to protect himself. And I know in the world we live in, like, there's some gender confusion and roles. Okay, this should be like the least confusing thing ever. The guy is supposed to protect his wife, not use her as a shield to protect him. Okay, Moses is an actual murderer. Rahab was an actual prostitute. Samson, womanizer, adulterer. David, a absent, unloving father, murderer, adulterer. Like, these are our heroes. So two things, okay? Number one, why does God use such flawed people as examples? Well, first of all, that's the only people he ever has to work with. Apart from Jesus, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, number one. But number two, and I think this is a bigger picture, I think God wanted us to have hope. Amen. That if God can use them, we will never be disqualified from being of service in God's kingdom. But that matters because we are in an era where people want to cancel, like the George Washingtons, for not being perfect. Okay, nothing about the story is perfect. It's rather how a perfect God has used imperfect people and did incredible things through them. If you guys want to know more, we have a website, wallbuilders.com. We have all kinds of resources there. But I want to close with the thought and encouragement and challenge that you should have hope, knowing who God is, that he is bigger than our failures and our faults, but also that he has used people in the story of this nation to incredible lengths to make us the most free, stable, prosperous nation in the history of the world. Not that there weren't major flaws and mistakes along the way, but rather, as we even get ready for 4th of July, we should celebrate how a perfect God used imperfect people and did great things through them.